Welcome to Final Note Interviews. My guest today is both a composer, performer, and educator. He's been in the business for quite a while. He's a professional keyboardist, a founding member of the band Utopia. He's arranged and performed in multiple albums featuring a host of other musicians, including Todd Rundgren, Carole King, Bob Dylan, and many others. I know him best as the composer of the first three Pokemon films. Ralph Schuckett, how are you this afternoon?
I'm great.
I'd like to start with the basic introductory question and ask you how you got into music. What started your fascination with music, and when did you start your career in performing and composing music?
My parents and my relatives would tell me that I would sit in front of the family record player and just listen to music over and over again. That I would move my body to it. I guess it just, and my parents played a lot of music in the house. They, they played a lot of records, mostly, I guess, mostly classical music. And so I got into it that way. And then when I was around in my, I guess, middle school age, like 13 or 14, I had an older sister who was a blues and jazz fan, and she used to take me to hear all these great blues and jazz artists play, and that just kind of blew my mind. I had a lot of friends that were into music, and so we started bands. Probably first year in high school, I was always in a band or several bands. The way I got to do it professionally was kind of being in the right place at the right time, I guess. A high school girlfriend of mine called me up and told me about this band that had a record contract, and they were missing one person, and would I come and audition for them? And I said yes, and they liked me, and so they let me join the band, and the band made a record on a major label, and during that experience, I met other musicians, I met people in the record business, and it's sort of, I did a lot of networking, and some of the networking was accidental, but I always seemed to meet the right people who were connected to a project or either a band or an artist, a film score, or some kind of, something that I could make money from. In those days, you could make money just being a high school band playing surf music for fraternity parties. You could actually make really good money while you were still in high school. I mean, it wasn't like we weren't millionaires or anything, but we would actually get paid to play. Nowadays, I think that doesn't happen anymore with young musicians. Now they really have to be really so dedicated that they're willing to work for free because so many people want to be musicians. But I was just really lucky, and also I guess I was kind of intelligent about. I was always easy to get along with, and I was always good at giving whoever I was working for what they wanted, even if they couldn't express it themselves. And so one step led to another, and I just kind of gradually became a professional eventually. And a lot of it was just luck and timing, because there's a lot of people that are just as talented as I am, and who no one's ever heard of and never made a penny from making music. But I got to spend my whole life doing what I love and getting paid for it. And that's like, I'm so grateful for that opportunity or those opportunities. And I don't take it for granted.
So they always say, do what you love, and you'll never have to work for a day in your life. But then you ask, well, how do I do that? And
Yeah.
they don't answer you.
Yeah. Well, nowadays it seems to be a lot of it has to do with maintaining an online presence,
Hmm.
social media presence, and and looking at yourself as a product and marketing that product. Young musicians and producers and songwriters and composers and stuff, and they spend more time online creating marketing schemes and tweeting and using Instagram and subscribing to blogs and writing in than they do actually creating music. You know, it's a business, and the people nowadays, my impression is that young people who really want to be successful at it, they just have to treat it as a business. And when I was coming up, I guess you could say, my friends and I never thought about business. You know, we were just creative, and we just played music, and most of us never got into marketing ourselves other than making hundreds of phone calls and begging and pleading and showing up at people's offices and hanging around and getting to know receptionists and assistants, just whatever we could do to get a foot in the door, you know. But nowadays it seems to me that you just have to create the whole thing. If you want a career in music, you basically have to invent yourself, get online and just plug away at as many blogs and websites and create as many Instagrams and SoundClouds and tweets and anything you can to attract people's curiosity. So you have to be not only the person who makes the music, but you have to come up with your own marketing concepts and your own visual style. You know, whatever you can think of that will attract attention to you and make people think that you're cool.
I still want to talk more about you, but I also want to talk about right now about your work on the Pokemon films, as I feel like it's the elephant in the room. So real,
Oh yeah,
so real,
that's the whole reason you contacted me, really. So I
so
have a tendency to digress. So feel free to interrupt me at any moment, because I mean, you don't need to be polite. I get off on tangents.
that's okay. So just real quick for the sake of this interview, for anyone listening, I do have to say that the score to Pokemon, the first movie, is one of my all-time favorite scores. And I guess one of my first questions is on how you found yourself composing for the movie. Because I know you started working with 4Kids around that time, but did you have any idea that you would be composing for a movie rather early on?
Actually, John Leffler, who's credited with composing the music along with me, was the music supervisor for 4Kids, and he and I had worked together for years previous to that as songwriting partners, and we had a commercial music production company, and we did a lot of music for TV commercials, and that's how we made a living. And then John also, he spent a lot of time networking, and he submitted our work for projects like a music supervisor or a music executive producer of music for 4Kids. And and Pokemon was a TV show at first, and he approached me, but they had no budget really for music, so he approached me when they were doing the American version. It was already popular in Asia, but the intent of our music was to be more accessible to Americans and Canadians and Europeans and South Americans and, you know, sort of the Western world. And so the producer of this show, John, approached me to do music for the TV show, but he couldn't pay me anything up front. So I would be doing all this work, and my only compensation would be if the show was successful and the performance royalties be my pay, but I wouldn't get up anything up front. And I had a family to support, and I just couldn't afford to put that much time into something that was basically speculative. And to me, it was like, I don't even, I don't even really get this. Um, it's really the whole purpose of the show was to sell the cards and the toys and the little plastic creatures and all that stuff. And none of us had any idea. It's not like we were saying this is going to be huge. Everybody involved on the American side, it was just kind of a speculative venture. We were saying, well, they seem to like it in Asia, so maybe it'll do well here. But I didn't even really take it seriously.
Yeah.
Long story short, you got a couple of other guys to do the music for the first season of the TV show, or the first two seasons. And I guess they could afford to do it on spec. But the producer, Norman Grossfeld, is also the head writer of the English version of the script, wasn't pleased. He didn't feel that the music, these two guys' music, was cinematic enough, and that it didn't have enough emotion in it. And he really was intent upon, for the movie, really exaggerating and enhancing the emotion of every character. And because these things were produced really fast.
Yeah.
And the scripts were written vaguely followed the Japanese plot, but they were really written to the mouth, the lip movements of the cartoons, of the animation. And there were few voiceovers or narrators explaining things. So the team of writers who wrote this stuff, they had to make it fit the lip movements of the characters. And they had a very short time to do it. I mean, these guys were brilliant, maybe I'm being too detailed here, but anyway, so the head of 4-Digit Production got in touch with all the composers' agents in New York and LA, were the people who supposedly hooked up composers with projects. And they had piles of CDs from every agent of, maybe, 150 different composers at least. And they would listen to the stuff, and it was kind of overwhelming. And they said, well, I don't know. I mean, all these guys seem to be pretty good. But Norman, he wasn't really knocked out by any of it. And so John Leffler recommended me, and I was living in LA at the time, and I flew into New York to meet with Norman, and we spotted several, I don't remember how much, but roughly about 10 minutes worth of cues, worth of scenes from the movie that he thought were sort of important scenes that needed music, and sent me home and said, write me some music for this. And if I like it, you can have the gig. So that's what I did. So I had 10 minutes worth of scenes from the movie, and we had conversations about it. He would tell me sort of the mood that he wanted to capture, and he would point out various characters, and he wanted every main character to have a theme, like a simple, recognizable melody that would play whenever that character was on the screen. And it had to be kind of catchy, and it had to sort of encapsulate the personality of that character. So I went home and started writing music, and John Leffler, I don't remember if we did it in New York or if we did it in LA, but one of us flew to the other coast, and basically we made up themes for each character, or for most of the characters. John was involved in a lot of different projects, and he didn't really have time to actually sit down and compose the music. and orchestrated and all that stuff. So he and I made up themes for each character, or each, there was a battle theme, and there was, if there was, there were a lot of storms and ocean scenes where people were riding on, rough waves. So we were assigned a theme. Norman Grossfeld would say, this guy needs a theme, or this battle needs a theme, and he wanted it all to be very recognizable and to sort of contain the emotion of what was going on the screen. And it's really an old school, kind of an old school style that he wanted. He didn't want a contemporary pop score with, hip drum grooves and synthesizers and electric guitars and all that stuff. He was more interested in sort of traditional cartoon music and music or film music, let's say from the 30s and 40s. It was very over the top dramatic. It was basically classical music. It was basically 20th century classical music. Most film scores were in the 30s and 40s and 50s. That's what they were. And that's more the kind of feeling he was going for. So in terms of the orchestration and instrumentation and stuff like that. So John and I would write these little 3 or 4 note themes for each character, and then John would leave, and I would score to the picture. I would take those themes and weave them in and out of the music. And so I spent, I don't know, maybe a week and a half working on those 10 minutes of scenes. And then I sent him back to New York, and I loved him. And so he gave me the gig, and then they had me fly to New York, since 4Kids offices were in New York, and they had a 12-story building in Manhattan, and all the offices were taken, but there was this one tiny office at the end of a hall on one floor that wasn't taken, but it was the office where all the people from the other offices deposited their trash. So, if they had like a computer that didn't work, or, if they had like boxes and boxes of videotapes, trash cans that they didn't have room for or anything, they just throw it in this little office. And that was my office. So, and it was a big building, and the company had a bathroom and a shower for the executives, and they had a big, really comfortable couch in one part of the building where they met with clients. And so that was all mine. And so I would sleep there and wake up and go and use the bathroom and take a shower and everything. And so I holed up there for about, I guess it was 6 weeks. And every day I'd go to the office and start writing the music. And I was oblivious to all this garbage that was surrounding me. And I guess I if I had more self-esteem, I probably would say, take this fucking crap out of here. This is my office, okay? It's not a garbage dump. But to be honest, I was having so much fun writing the music that I didn't even notice the garbage. So, I start writing music for different scenes, and then sequencing it with orchestral samples. I had several different sample libraries of orchestral sound, and so I would do a mock-up of a real orchestra, playing the music, and I would meet with Norman every time I finished a cue. His office was down the hall, and I would come in and show it to him, and he would critique it. And sometimes I had to rewrite it, or sometimes he would point out certain facial expressions and bodily movements that he wanted the music to follow exactly. And doing music for animation is probably the most difficult technically the most difficult kind of composing you can do, because every time somebody moves a muscle or smiles or a tear comes out of their eye, or, every bodily movement and every emotion in the face has to be exaggerated. But he didn't want it to sound like Bugs Bunny or Porky Pig cartoons, because those were all funny. And even though Pokemon had some humorous moments where the music was funny, most of it was really intense, kind of Eastern European 20th century music. And so basically I did that for a few weeks, and then none of us had, I had done one other film score previous to that, and that film score, they needed a small amount of music, so it was orchestral music, but it was maybe 15 minutes worth of music, whereas those movies have wall to wall music practically. And I was really naive. I mean, I was coming from a background of being kind of a rock and roll R&B piano player, basically. And that was my whole experience, had been playing piano or organ or synthesizers on records. I'd never composed for an orchestra before, and I didn't have a college education to do that. Actually, I had written for orchestra before, but it was all on pop records. But I always loved Eastern European classical music, modern classical music, and romantic music, and composers like Stravinsky and Bartok, and Aaron Copland, and I don't know, I can't think of all the names at the moment, but I always gravitated towards really emotional. All this music was kind of polytonal and very complicated harmonically and very dense. And so for me, it was kind of an education. I was being paid basically to learn how to write that kind of music. So it was really a lucky break, because there were hundreds of composers or thousands of composers all over the world who went to college to learn how to write that kind of music, and who had lots of tricks up their sleeves, so to speak. And I didn't have any of that. I was just going on inspiration, which I don't know where it came from. It came from the powers that be, the powers of the universe, or God, or whatever you choose to call it. And so I was just having a blast exploring all these different options, because since I had been in the record business or doing TV commercials, the music was always very simple and limited to what would sound like a hit on the radio, like what would teenagers buy. And all of a sudden, I was in deep water. I was trying to write, like all these classical composers, without the benefit of the college, of the conservatory education. But I did have a lot of, I bought a couple of books on orchestration, on dynamics, how to balance the different sections of the orchestra, a lot of really detailed information about what sounded good, which combination sounded good, and if you wrote music for, let's say, a trumpet or 4 trumpets or 3 trumpets, if you had violins playing at the same time, they had to be playing really loud, and if it was a soft piece of music that you needed 3 trumpets on, the trumpets had to be playing in a certain range and be playing a lot softer, and stuff like that. What instruments sound good together. An oboe and a flute sounds good together, or a clarinet and a flute sound good together. And all these little kind of minuscule details writing for an orchestra entails things that were complicated harmonically. I learned how to do all that kind of stuff. And so, although it was totally uncalled for in pop, and so I was just having a blast exploring all these different possibilities, because I was basically free to do emotional, as long as it portrayed the right emotions and it sounded professional, I was free to do whatever I wanted. It didn't have to be a sexy song with a good beat. So I just had a blast. I mean, I was really inspired, and I would just try things. And I would look in the orchestrator books, you know, if I said, I think there'll be a clarinet here. What are my options? And so I got an idea, and I started to realize that, well, this stuff is not that difficult if you learn it, if you hear it in your head, which I did. So basically, that's what happened. But then, like, after about 2-3 weeks into the project, I realized that there's no way I'm going to finish this on deadline. And I was really innocent about writing movie scores. And I called a couple of my friends who were composers who had more experience than I did. And they told me, nobody orchestrates their own stuff. You're working too hard. You have orchestrators. So you just map out, what you should do is just map out kind of a sketch of what the scene needs, and then give it to a professional orchestrator, and they will fill in the lines, you know, fill in the stuff. You just tell them what you want to happen. Instead of writing every note of violin lines, you know, like a really, you know, fast, complicated line. You just give them the first note and the last note of the line, and you say, fill this in with a lot of fast stuff. and they do it for you. You know? and I didn't realize that film composers did this, because film composers rarely, and they've been doing that ever since the beginning of film composing, because they rarely have the time to do all the orchestration. All of a sudden, there were brand new budgetary considerations, which none of us had expected, because you got to pay these orchestrators. And so we just started calling some of these guys and saying, can you help me out with this project? And so basically, by that time, I had done the music, let's say, for maybe 10 or 12 or 15 cues. And each Pokemon movie had 50 or 60 cues. And a cue is basically a specific scene in the movie. And some cues are 5 seconds long and some are 10 minutes long. And it just so happens that I had done a lot of the long ones, so that contained all the type of orchestration that I wanted. And basically, I created a palette of sounds and instrument combinations and harmonic and melodic styles and motifs. And so I had like 10 or 15 stuff that the cues that I completed myself to show these orchestrators as examples of what I wanted it to sound like. And so they were all very thoroughly classically trained. A lot of them were way, way more legitimately trained than I was. A couple of these guys had PhDs in conducting classical music. Or, you know, like one guy was a piano virtuoso who could play any piece of music you put in front of him. He could just sight read it, you know, no matter how difficult or how, you know, fast it was, or how harmonically difficult it was. He could just look at it and play the whole thing. So these guys had a whole lot of tricks up their sleeve that I had never been taught. But my music sounded like I had that education, because I pretty much just educated myself. I found like 3 or 4 people to orchestrate this stuff for me. In fact, in certain cases when we were really under the gun, they would actually compose. There's some cues in the movie that I didn't even compose. They used my theme in the theme material that John Leffler and I created as a basis, and they used the palette that I created, the sound palette, types of sounds that I used, but then they would just write the music, the whole cue themselves. So probably 2/3, I'd say, or maybe, I don't even remember, each movie was different, but you could probably say that half the music was written and orchestrated by me, and the other half was orchestrated by a team of orchestrators. And they were also programmers, they also knew how to do computerized music, and they all had the same music libraries that I did, so they could copy, pretty much the same sounds. And that's how we got it finished on time, but it added what was originally like maybe a $60,000 budget, most of which was my fee, ended up being probably $170,000 because we had to pay other people to do the orchestrations, and there was just no way around it.
Yeah.
And at first I felt like, oh my God, poor kids and people are going to think I'm incompetent or something. But then I did a lot of research and spoke to a lot of people, and everybody said, hey, John Williams on all the Star Wars movies, he didn't orchestrate that. He orchestrated maybe a third of it, but he was too busy touring the world, conducting the Boston Pop Orchestra and being a celebrity conductor all over the world, and he didn't have time to sit down and look at everything. So he orchestrated a few things, and then he had like 11 people, 11 orchestrators write the rest of the stuff. And this is by all means not to take away from him, because he's a master at what we were trying to accomplish, and what a lot of movies, particularly in the old days, did. The music was thematic, as I was saying, meaning there was a melody for every character. There was a theme melody that was catchy and recognizable, and was like a hook, like a pop hook. And so John Williams came up with some amazing hooks for Star Wars,
Yeah.
I mean, they're so memorable, and believe me, that is not easy. Even if it's something that only has 3 notes in it, like da 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 for Darth Vader. Most composers will write 11 or 12 melodies before they come up with the one that's as catchy as that. So these film composers, even if they didn't orchestrate the whole thing, they still come up with the hooks, and that's not it's not easy. If it was easy, everyone would have a hit record, and everyone would have a catchy movie score. Nowadays, particularly, most movies, the hit thing to do in movie scores now, you'll find that most of the music is very minimal. It might sound important and grandiose and emotionally evocative, but it's really, really simple, because ever since rock and roll became popular and drum beats became popular, most movie scores have a lot of big chords, like power chords that a rock guitar player would play, except they're orchestrated for orchestras, and they have these cool drum beats that are either programmed or played by several great drummers and percussionists who have all kinds of interesting instruments. And so there's not as many movies these days that have melodic themes for each character. That's in fashion now. Nowadays, if the script is really great and the acting is really great and the cinematography is gorgeous, you really don't need the music. Just has to sort of help that. In fact, a lot of the music designed to not be interesting unto itself, because it'll take the audience's attention away from the dialogue or the scene. And so nowadays, the composers, for most movies, they write really minimal stuff, which is not to downgrade it at all. I mean, a lot of it is just brilliant, I've been told by composers' agents that my music is too interesting and that it'll take attention away from the dialogue or whatever else is going on in the movie. But for cartoon music is usually very complicated because the producers and directors and writers want to exaggerate every emotion. Cartoons, they're two-dimensional characters, and so the music has to be more. You have to take that kind of stuff in consideration, particularly with anime, which is so simple. I mean, some of it is gorgeous and beautiful, the colors and the scenery and some of this really amazing Japanese stuff is beautiful unto itself, even without music. But a lot of it is very minimal, and the characters are two-dimensional, and so the music has to be very exaggerated, basically to feed into the head of the audience what they're supposed to feel. Because if you just looked at the facial expressions of these flat characters, you might not get what they're feeling. And a lot of times the scripts are written so fast to fit these lit movements that, they're pretty superficial too, you know what I mean? And sometimes they don't even make sense.
One of the things I wanted to say was when I was listening to you talk about first doing the score and the whole process of creating it, and other people who helped out and all of that. One of the things that there's several things that struck me. First of all, the score has humble roots. Building the score in the office next to some garbage, which is it's fascinating for me to hear, though, because I mean this has always been a sort of mysterious score for this first movie and the second movie too. I've always just kind of thought someone had to have been behind the scenes writing this music because it's too crafty, it's too clever. Who was the person behind that? And then I discovered you, and this is several years ago, but so it was interesting to hear what you had to say on that creation front. Another thing that you mentioned, it's strange. There's a lot of, when it comes to scoring music for animated films, some composers like to take the angle where they sort of write music. It's written to reflect the actions or the movements of the characters. And I feel that's what this score does, but it does it in a way that feels very musical. I feel like some composers kind of use it where a sounding of the trumpet or violin is just kind of like a glorified sound effect or something. And this is this was very musical and very, like you said, thematic. And again, you were talking about like the comparison of John Williams becoming famous for writing a lot of that thematic music, like something like the theme of Darth Vader. And when you said that, I couldn't help but think of one of the main principal themes throughout the score. I'm just going to dub it as Mewtwo's score, the villain of the first movie. And there's a lot of dark, imposing music in those spots, but you can also sense this kind of more troubling sort of emotion weaving in and out of the score. That's one of the things that has always taken me aback by this score, and one of the reasons I really appreciate it is because you have these even exchanges of emotions, and it all kind of runs together, no matter which character's theme is currently being concentrated on. It all together makes for something that I think kind of rises above, for me, most animated scores and most film scores in general, because and you were also talking about classical European influences, romantic music and such, and that kind of stuff being incorporated into the score as well as movies back then. And I was thinking about the score to a movie called Tender is it's a movie based on F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel Tender is the Night. And I remember listening to music from that movie, and it was really overblown. Like anytime they had a character that was about to crack or something, the string section would keep rising and rising, and it would just keep getting louder and louder and louder. And it was just like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. This is just a very simple scene between two people talking. You don't need this much musical concentration. And the score to Pokemon, the first movie, by contrast, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of power in there, but there's also a kind of concentration. Like, I know you used the word exaggerated to describe certain things you needed to do to write the music. And I definitely agree with the use of that word. But the only thing that scares me about that word is some people might think, that the music's overblown or something like that. And it definitely gets serious and intense. But I think you also have, again, it's that equal exchange of emotions throughout the score and themes that weave in and out. So you get a healthy dosage of each element in the score. And I don't know, I kind of went on a tangent there. I didn't mean to talk for that long, but I just kind of wanted to express just my appreciation for the score. Because, I was only listening to it earlier today just to prepare for this interview, and it still holds up. I listened to the whole thing. So, it's still one of my absolute favorites.
Well, thank you. I think the cohesiveness of it is partially because of the direction I got from the producer, but also a lot of it is just, I had so little time, and and we didn't have much of a budget. I was really kind of under the gun, and I was learning as I went along. I was thinking about it the other day when I knew you were going to interview me, and some of it just really happened, not by accident, but it's like for most of it, I didn't even really have time to think about it, But I did consciously. One thing that I meant to do consciously was just have the music sort of be seamless in spots where the emotions would switch. The emotions change so quickly that it's really hard to glue them together in a way that's seamless musically. And so that I did work really hard on, because I've seen a lot of, even like cartoons like Bugs Bunny or Tom and Jerry, a lot of the music is like what you mentioned, which it's almost like sound effects.
Yeah.
And the changes of emotion are abrupt, and so it doesn't hang together as a piece of music that you would listen to for fun or for your own enjoyment, because it's just little small segments that aren't even really particularly connected. I sort of had a voice in my head saying, it's got to be seamless, and it's got to be, it can't just be, da 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 da,
Yeah.
It can't just be like when there's tension, there's a diminished chord, and then when there's happiness, there's a major chord, and it has to, and this is something that I stressed to the orchestrators too, is that, in other words, my, I guess, aesthetic was to have it be more seamless and to have it be melodically satisfying, so that it just didn't sound like disconnected, short little bursts.
You were also talking about when you were creating it, there was this kind of sense of playfulness. Like you talked about having orchestrated before, but this was definitely a lot different. And you sort of got the chance to play around with instruments in terms of their sound and combinations and textures. And
Yeah.
so I mean, I feel like it's really impressive. Like there was also, I mean, like you said, it was you, and you also had help from orchestrators, and I can't remember who his name was, who you were talking about before. John Norman, I think. Was that his name?
Norman was the my boss. Or
Yeah.
Norman was the head writer and producer of pretty much all of Four Kids shows.
I just kind of find it funny that he was so insistent on getting this powerful moving score, and that he had all these samples, and then he found you, and it was the perfect fit, basically.
Yeah, yeah. To this day, I don't know if you're familiar with the term imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
but to this day, sometimes I'll think about that time when I was writing this stuff, and I and I think like, how did I do that? Like, I don't even know if I could do it today.
Yeah.
Because it just was kind of a whirlwind. But it was great to have somebody like Norman and like John Leffler, who sort of provided the kind of the big picture overview of everything, and so that I didn't get hung up in little details. But when we spotted, composers would they get together with the director and they spot the movie, and it's long. They have long meetings. Our meetings were like 3 or 4 hours, where we'd watch the movie and then we'd stop it, and Norman would explain what he wanted to happen at at that section, and I would take extensive notes. Because at first it really shocked me, because when I the first couple of pieces that I gave him were 20 or 30 seconds long, and he would say stuff like, "I'm just not getting the emotion," and I'd say, "But yeah, but listen to that groove, and listen to that cool synth sound, and listen to that guitar solo or whatever." And he said, "But I'm trying to figure out how to." He was having trouble verbalizing
Mm.
what he was missing, but eventually he said, "You know what it is? It's the melodies." He said, "I want the melodies to evoke emotion." And frankly, in all my experience in being a professional in the music business, I had never even really thought of that.
Mm.
If I wrote a song, I would just sit down at the piano and start singing and playing chords and finding things that were satisfying. But I never thought, well, how do I make this part sad? How do I make this part happy? Or how do I create tension here and release? And I never thought about stuff like that, which is the kind of stuff they teach you in music school. Like there are a lot of tricks to create tension and release in music. And it has to do with the shape of the melody, the types of chords that are created underneath it. And so now, if I got another assignment to do another movie today, I would probably be able to do it a lot quicker, because now I kind of have a bunch of tricks to fall back on. But I learned it all in doing those 3 movies kind of haphazardly.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense because, I mean, I don't know how this is gonna sound, but I mean, it kind of makes sense because you were very experimental, and from what I gather, you're very experimental, playful, and sort of learning as you go, as you were creating this score. And I don't know if some composers who maybe have that background, they might have made the mistake of maybe trying too hard to emphasize certain things, especially going by what Norman wanted and wanting that delivery of emotion. And I don't know, they might have
Yeah.
overdone it. And the other thing is too, I mean, with the score, with all scores, I mean, you have something that's melodically driven and very evocative, but conservative enough because of, I guess, the context of the movie that you were working with to create
Hmm.
an emotional score that really delivers on its promise, but doesn't ever really go overboard. And I think I used the word before, but it has a sense of maturity about it. So yeah.
Well, thank you, thank you. Have you heard the score of the second movie, Pokemon 2000?
I did, yeah. I have.
Yeah, because that was kind of where it all came together for me. All these elements that I'm talking about. That movie was even more. There was a lot of stuff that I had to, a lot of visuals that I had to hit with musical notes. And so the theme song of the movie. I don't know if you remember the movie, but there's an towards the end there's an island that has 7 pillars
Mhm.
to, and they light, oh yeah, so they light up when they're becoming activated, and he wanted each column to have a note from the theme of the movie, and he wanted them within what was going on at the time. Every time one of those columns lit up, he wanted that specific note from the theme to be obviously right on the money with when the column lit up. So I had to choose notes to fit each column, and that's one of the ways we came up with the melody, the theme song melody. You know, a lot of creative people, artists and musicians say that they work really well with restrictions. In fact, some of them impose restrictions on themselves before they even start writing the music. Having those restrictions, in a way, it gives you more freedom. It's sort of relaxing in a way because
Mhm.
you feel like, well, I have a goal here. I'm climbing a mountain, and I have to get a foothold on the pre-carved, foothold, and I can't stray from that. But I still have to be creative within that. And for a lot of people I know, that almost makes them feel freer because if somebody said, write me some music, take as long as you want, and do whatever you want, and it doesn't matter, but as soon as you're done, give it to me and I'll pay you or something. It would probably take me years to do that because there's so many options. There's so many ways you could go. You could drive yourself crazy. So in a way, my whole career has been a work for hire. So everything I've ever written, there's been a format for it, or there's been restrictions for it. I actually really enjoy that because, and it's a challenge. Like with all these scores, especially the first two movies, I intentionally wanted the music to sound harmonically sort of dense, but I also wanted to break some rules so that it didn't sound old-fashioned.
Well, speaking of that, speaking of limitations, I remember you talking about for the first movie not wanting to have or someone telling you they didn't want some kind of pop beat or whatever however you would call
Yeah,
it. But
yeah,
in the Pokemon 2000 score, there is one piece. I think it's "The World Turns to Ash," and I think it's about like the 2 minute 40 second mark. You have of that piece. You have a sort of drums going on in the background, along with some kind of electronic sound that kind of makes the
uh-huh.
rhythm of the piece, and then you have sort of instrumentals on top of that. And it's a really cool piece, both within the context of the movie and just by listening to it, because it's got this very skippy kick to it, but it's also very serious at the same time. So it's a kind of
Huh.
surreal pop symphonic mesh, but it works and it's
Yeah.
cool.
Well, as we went on to the second and third movies, um, Norman sort of loosened up a little bit. He gave me a little bit of permission to use contemporary sounds. I'll have to listen to the record to see The World Turns to Ash, but I know, or maybe it's in the third movie. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's a couple of pieces of music that almost sound like drum and bass dance music or electronic dance music, EDM, but with orchestral instruments playing over it. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's kind of it's an underwater battle. When you're doing work for a deadline, it's really like a whirlwind, and something that sometimes you really don't have time to think about it. And
it's a very odd blessing in disguise, maybe.
Yeah, it's sort of a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
Because like with 4Kids Productions, because I ended up being the chief composer for all their TV shows.
Right.
And I didn't have the time to write. Sometimes there were 3 or 4 shows introduced in one season, 3 or 4 new shows, and I didn't have the time to score all of them. So I had to, John Siegler sort of took over John Leffler's job as music supervisor, and he's a musician, and a very good musician, and so he was really easy to work with, and he understood, and also he's my best friend. We played on a lot of the same records, and we were roommates, and so we really understood each other. John ended up kind of being the person that had the final say, and he was right on the money, and he could explain what he wanted in musical terms that I would immediately understand. So that went a lot quicker. But by the time we got to the third movie, it was kind of a well-oiled machine where nobody had to talk much about anything. We just kind of got it done. The only things we had to discuss was the logistics and the budget.
Did you make a profit off of the first movie score, or no?
Did I make a profit?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, because I got a fee for doing the first movie, and then they started using music from the movies on the TV shows.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And then eventually the music editors for the TV show started using music from, let's say, Pokemon, one of the Pokemon movies, for a different show, just because it happened to fit the scene that they were editing to. Yeah. And so eventually it got all mixed up. And it was all pretty much the same style because I'm the one who sort of created the palette, and that was what Norman liked. It all kind of went together. In fact, I noticed when I was watching the first 3 movies to this week, and this wasn't even intentional, but I noticed a spot, I think it was in the first movie, where there was actually a quote, not intentional, of the theme song for the second movie in one scene. It was almost the same melody. It might have been the exact same melody. And it was funny because
neat.
I never noticed it before, but it was almost like I did it on purpose as a preview, as a foreshadowing the next movie,
No, that's pretty cool. I gotta watch the second movie now. I want to hear that.
In the third movie, the main character is a little girl, so the music is a lot of the music is very pretty and sort of girly, and but it's I think some of the best music. There's also really creepy music in it, and because there are these characters, these bad characters that are kind of crazy, who are creating chaos in the world, and but in a way, I think that score almost hangs together together better than the first two. Musically, it's almost like schmaltzy or corny, but it's the kind of music you hear in movies, in like romantic comedies and stuff like that. It's not necessarily unique. It's not as unique as the music in the first two movies, but it's really effective, and it's really seamless. And there's also some modern kind of almost atonal, adventurous, edgy music in that movie too. For the more the creepy stuff is happening.
I mean, even for anyone listening, even if you haven't seen the first three Pokemon films, I mean, I find them to be interesting to listen to, possibly even if you haven't seen the movies, because they are well constructed. They are melodically and thematically driven. All three of the scores. So, because I can barely even remember the third movie itself after seeing it as a kid, but the music is still the music still stands on its own, even so, especially as well for the first two movies. Because I mean, seeing the first movie as a kid, I enjoyed it fine because I was a kid. It was fun to see a Saturday morning cartoon that you watch in the theater. But and I like the animation because you have a higher budget for a movie, and I've always kind of liked how, like you said earlier, especially in, I think it's Japanese animation, but I think other animation studios mess with it too. It's just that play of light and shadow that I really like to see animated. I still enjoy the music from them, and and that goes even going back to being a kid when I saw the first movie in the theater, and the first thing I noticed was the music, and that's what really yeah, it was. It was like the first thing that kept me really attached and driven throughout the whole film. When I had the video on VHS, I kind of had that moment to myself where I was like, I think the only reason I'm watching this over and over again is because I like the music. So
That's
yeah.
amazing because when we made the music, I mean, my take on it was, I really like this music and it's really effective, but the kids are never going to pay attention to this because the sound effects are so loud and the dialogue is so loud. It was almost like at that time, I didn't realize how important music is to the cinematic experience. I listened to a lot of film scores that I liked, but when I watched the movie, I didn't. Previous to that, I never analyzed anything, or I might have noticed the music, but not sort of focused on it. And but then when I got that job, I started to focus on. I bought a lot of soundtracks, and I went to the movies a lot, and I watched a lot of. It was also because my son was at the age where he was watching cartoons all the time, and so I watched tons of cartoons with him on Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and stuff, and I started listening to music and paying attention to it. But when we were none of us in the team, except for Norman Grossfeld, who was in charge of everything, none of us thought that anyone would really pick up on the music. And since I've been talking to you, or even before that, I've gotten a lot of fan mail about the music, and I've gotten people have sent me links to YouTube, and I read, some of these YouTube segments have like millions of views and hundreds of comments, and I started reading the comments, realizing that this music really meant a lot to these kids. The movies all have positive messages, and I saw all these quotes of, like, you know, things kids like. As soon as I hear the first note of that scene, I burst out in tears. And even to this day, it makes me cry. And there were so many people who actually felt the emotion. And I'm not like blowing my own horn or anything, but there's so many people that said, like, how did these guys do it? How did they create something that was so perfect?
And you come out saying garbage, lots of garbage.
Yeah, and it just blew my mind. I mean, to tell you the truth, it almost made me burst out in tears because I had no idea that kids would even pay attention to the music except kind of as a subliminal thing. And people who wrote about it, people who commented, picked up on all the nuances of everything. And, would say stuff like, I have that part when Nash does this, Misty says this, and the violins come in. When I started reading, and I just started reading that stuff, I think it's pretty much right around the time I guess it was when I looked at your website or your channel, and then, on the right side, there's all these other links that are related. And so I started looking at them and reading these comments. And it really surprised me, and I guess delighted me that somebody actually noticed and that I guess the music did its job, created emotion that even though now these kids are in their 20s and 30s, and they still to this day have those emotions when they hear that music. So that just like made me feel so good because believe me, it wasn't that we were cynical about it, but none of us had the vision for the future of that show, except for Norman, and the rest of us were like, what the hell, let's give it a shot. You never know what kids might like. That's basically kind of what our mindset was. I mean, we were serious about doing the job well, but we had no idea that it was going to really affect anybody. So anyway, it's just interesting that you said all those things, and you're not the only one. I mean, there's hundreds of comments that are like that, So it's a big kind of ego boost for me.
The reaction is totally justified, I think. So, I mean, it's pretty cool, I would imagine, to get that reaction. Must be very humbling.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and it's funny because when the first Pokemon movie came out, it was a huge commercial success. So I was able to meet with every composer's agent in LA. And all my friends told me, oh man, Pokemon's the #1 movie in the country, for the last 3 weeks or whatever. And these guys are going to flip out over you, and they're going to get you a lot of work. And virtually every one of them said, look, your music is really great, but I'm sorry I can't go to Ed Zwick and say, check out this guy Ralph, and he's going to say, well, what's his track record? And I'm going to say, well, he did a bunch of cheesy anime things for Saturday morning cartoon, and the guy's just going to laugh at me, No one's going to take that seriously because you get typecast and, your reputation is that, and nobody realizes that a lot of, and since then I've met a lot of composers who started out doing Saturday morning cartoons who ended up doing huge movies. I mean, like the guy who scored, I can't remember his name, but the guy who scored the last Star Trek movie, the first of the new Star Trek movies. I can't remember his name.
I think it's Michael. I think it's Michael Giacchino. I can't remember.
Yeah. That's the guy. So he started out doing music for a company that was very much, I forget the name of it, that was very much like 4Kids, for like really lousy money because one of my friends was connected with that company and recommended me to them, and they put out a ton of Saturday morning cartoons, and he had been their main composer. And when I met with the music supervisor, he said, "Look, I'll tell you up front, you're not going to get any performance royalties for the first 3 years, and we can't. There's no budget to pay you, and you have to work from the storyboards. So you have to write the music to the storyboards, which are all timed out. And so you have to imagine what the movie's going to look like from the storyboards." And the pay was like maybe they were going to pay me something, but it was like just minuscule. It was like there's union scale for legitimate film composers and TV composers, where they pay you by the page or by the number of bars or by the number of instruments or whatever. And it's really good money, but none of those companies go through the union. And so I said, "Listen, I'd love to work for you, but I can't afford to work this cheaply, and I'm not going to give up my first 3 years of writer's royalties. That should be illegal, And they said, "Well, yeah, that's why Michael Giacchino left, because when you come to, a place like LA and you just got out of college and you're just raring to go, you'll do anything for free, and that's one of the reasons, the musicians union has just gone downhill, and like hardly any projects are ever done through the union anymore, except super big budget feature films. And there are kids who just got out of music school that it will literally, they would pay the company for the opportunity to have that experience, to be able to have that credit on their reel.
That's crazy.
So there's all these people who are super educated nowadays from music schools, and they have, they have wealthy parents, so their parents bought them like cutting edge gear, like every possible, recording gear that they would ever need, and they're super qualified, and they're willing to work for nothing.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of goes along with what I earlier said about sort of the devaluation of music. So you got all this music out there, and everybody wants to be a star, and everyone wants to be famous, and so they're just willing to do whatever it takes, even if they're not being paid. And to me, that's just a crime. I mean, it's the way the business works, but it's so disrespectful. Being a composer and a songwriter, it's the only profession in the world, I think, where you don't get paid for your work up front, unless you're lucky enough to have a job where they have enough of a budget to pay you.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like from all of this, there's going to be a bunch of composers at the gate for the Los Angeles Chargers to create a new theme song for them.
Yeah, I mean, even it used to be really easy to do music for commercials. I mean, relatively easy. There's a lot of politics involved, but it's only 30 seconds of music. I used to do like 3 or 4 commercials a day because they're short. Even if you don't quite know what you're doing, or even if you're trying something new, if you get in the studio and the client hates it, you can just rewrite it. If you have the discipline, you can write it in a half hour and it'll be okay. Change a few notes here and there, take out a couple of instruments to add something else. Nowadays, commercials or TV themes. I've written several TV themes, but I've had to compete with at least 14 other people for each show. It's just a competition, and they don't give you money for it. Or they might give you like $500, but you have to hire 7 musicians to get the sound that they're looking for. So you're paying the musicians out of your own pocket eventually.
I mean, the show business there's some sick, twisted things, but just to end on the brighter side, end out this interview with the question of who are some of your favorite composers or musicians who may have inspired or interested you in some shape or form?
God, everybody. But I love, like film composers. I really, I really loved the music for the Batman movies.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that was Danny Elfman, and some of that was actually the movie score that sort of influenced me the most for the Pokemon movies was by Elliot Goldenthal. I forget which Batman movie it was, but
yeah, he did one Batman movie, I think. I mean,
yeah,
just
I think
one.
it was Batman and Robin, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'll have to look it up.
And it was more harmonically adventurous and orchestrationally unorthodox.
Yeah. A lot of people do like that score.
Sorry?
A lot of people do like that score. I think it's a rather famous score, fairly.
Yeah, yeah. And he's, I mean, I love Danny Elfman's work, but it was sort of like, it was nothing new. It's already been done in classical music with the same, it's, and I'm not downplaying it at all because Danny Elfman also comes up with the hooks, like John Williams does.
Well, thank you for doing this interview. I recommend to anyone listening to look up those Pokemon scores, whether you're a fan of the movies or not, because the music stands well on its own. I wish there was something else. Like I might just record later, just so I can add more thoughts to my feelings toward that score. But I definitely do it and hold it in special regard. And it was really great, really fascinating to actually hear about the creation of the score, because for the most part, I mean, it was a total mystery to me. So
Yeah,
it's really cool to actually get that behind the scenes. It's kind of surreal because I've just known the score for such a long time. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'm sure every composer has a different story too. I mean, some of them don't. Some just say, I wrote the score. We went and recorded it. I'm sure that happens a lot too.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for doing this interview,
Seth. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Seth. Take care.
You too.
What you just witnessed with your ears was a Final Note interview. Questions, comments, suggestions, tips, threats? Send them my way at timelessvibes11@gmail.com. timelessvibes11@gmail.com.